Chapter 27. Having finished some errands downtown the next afternoon, George Amberson Minifer was walking up National Avenue on his homeward way when he saw in the distance coming toward him, upon the same side of the street, the figure of a young lady, a figure just under the middle height, comely indeed, and to be mistaken for none other in the world, even at 200 yards. To his sharp discomfiture, his heart immediately forced upon him the consciousness of its acceleration. A sudden warmth about his neck made him aware that he had turned red, and then, departing, left him pale. For a panicky moment he thought of facing about in actual flight. He had little doubt that Lucy would meet him with no token of recognition, and all at once this probability struck him as unendurable. And if she did not speak, was it the proper part of chivalry to lift his hat and take the cut bareheaded? Or should the finer gentleman acquiesce in the lady's desire for no further acquaintance, and pass her with stony mien and eyes constrained forward? George was a young man badly flustered. But the girl approaching him was unaware of his trepidation, being perhaps somewhat preoccupied with her own. She saw only that he was pale and that his eyes were darkly circled, but here he was advantaged with her, for the finest touch to his good looks was given by this toning down, neither pallor nor dark circles detracting from them, but rather adding to them a melancholy favour of distinction. George had retained his mourning, a tribute completed down to the final details of black gloves and a polished ebony cane, which he would have been pained to name otherwise than as a walking-stick. And in the aura of this sombre elegance his straight figure and drawn face were not without a tristful and appealing dignity. In everything outward he was cause enough for a girl's cheek to flush, her heart to beat faster, and her eyes to warm with the soft light that came into Lucy's now, whether she would or no. If his spirit had been what his looks proclaimed it, she would have rejoiced to let the light glow forth which now shone in spite of her. For a long time, thinking of that spirit of his, and what she felt it should be, she had a persistent sense. It must be there. But she had determined to believe this folly no longer. Nevertheless, when she met him at the Sharons, she had been far less calm than she seemed. People speaking casually of Lucy were apt to define her as a little beauty, a definition short of the mark. She was a little beauty, but an independent, masterful, self-reliant little American, of whom her father's earlier gypsyings and her own sturdiness had made a woman ever since she was 15. But though she was the mistress of her own ways, and no slave to any lamp save that of her own conscience, she had a weakness. She had fallen in love with George Amberson Minifer at first sight, and no matter how she disciplined herself, she had never been able to climb out. The thing had happened to her, that was all. George had looked just the way she had always wanted someone to look, the riskiest of all the moonshine ambushes wherein tricky romance snares credulous young love. But what was fatal to Lucy was that this thing having happened to her, she could not change it. No matter what she discovered in George's nature, she was unable to take away what she had given him. And though she could think differently about him, she could not feel differently about him. For she was one of those too faithful victims of glamour. When she managed to keep the picture of George away from her mind's eye, she did well enough, but when she let him become visible, she could not choose but love what she disdained. She was a little angel who had fallen in love with high-handed Lucifer, quite an experience, and not apt to be soon succeeded by any falling in love with a tamer party. And the unhappy truth was that George did make better men seem tame, but though she was a victim, she was a heroic one, anything but helpless. As they drew nearer, George tried to prepare himself to meet her with some remnants of aplomb. He decided that he would keep on looking straight ahead, and lift his hand toward his hat at the very last moment when it would be possible for her to see him out of the corner of her eye. Then, when she thought it over later, she would not be sure whether he had saluted her or merely rubbed his forehead. And there was the added benefit that any third person who might chance to look from a window or from a passing carriage would not think that he was receiving a snub, because he did not intend to lift his hat, but, timing the gesture properly, would in fact actually rub his forehead. These were the hasty plans which occupied his thoughts until he was within about 50 feet of her, when he ceased to have either plans or thoughts. He had kept his eyes from looking full at her until then, and as he saw her thus close at hand and coming nearer, a regret that was dumbfounding took possession of him. For the first time he had the sense of having lost something of overwhelming importance. Lucy did not keep to the right, but came straight to meet him, smiling, and with her hand offered to him. "Why, he stammered as he took it. "Haven't you—" What he meant to say was, "Haven't you heard?" "Haven't I what?" she asked, and he saw that Eugene had not yet told her. "Nothing," he gasped. May I turn and walk with you a little way?" "Yes, indeed," she said cordially. He would not have altered what had been done. He was satisfied with all that, satisfied that it was right, and that his own course was right. But he began to perceive a striking inaccuracy in some remarks he had made to his mother. Now, when he had put matters in such shape that even by the relinquishment of his ideals of life he could not have Lucy, knew that he could never have her, and knew that when Eugene told her the history of yesterday he could not have a glance or word even friendly from her, now, when he must in good truth give up all idea of Lucy, he was amazed that he could have used such words as "no particular sacrifice," and believed them when he said them. She had looked never in his life so bewitchingly pretty as she did today, and as he walked beside her he was sure that she was the most exquisite thing in the world. "Lucy," he said huskily, "I want to tell you something that matters." "I hope it's a lively something then," she said, and laughed. "Papa's been so glum today he's scarcely spoken to me. Your Uncle George Amberson came to see him an hour ago, and they shut themselves up in the library, and your uncle looked as glum as Papa. I'd be glad if you'd tell me a funny story, George." "Well, it may seem one to you," he said bitterly. "Just to begin with, when you went away you didn't let me know, not even a word, not a line." Her manner persisted in being inconsequent. "Why, no," she said, "I just trotted off for some visits." "Well, at least you might have—" "Why, no," she said again briskly. "Don't you remember, George? We'd had a grand quarrel and didn't speak to each other all the way home from a long, long drive. So, as we couldn't play together like good children, of course it was plain that we oughtn't to play at all." "Play?" he cried. "Yes. What I mean is that we'd come to the point where it was time to quit playing. Well, what we were playing." "At being lovers, you mean, don't you?" "Something like that," she said lightly. "For us two, playing at being lovers was just the same as playing at cross purposes. I had all the purposes, and that gave you all the crossness. Things weren't getting along at all. It was absurd." "Well, have it your own way," he said. "It needn't have been absurd." "No, it couldn't help but be," she informed him cheerfully. "The way I am, and the way you are, it couldn't ever be anything else. So what was the use?" "I don't know," he sighed, and his sigh was abysmal. "But what I wanted to tell you is this. When you went away, you didn't let me know and didn't care how or when I heard it, but it's not like that with you. This time I'm going away. That's what I wanted to tell you. I'm going away tomorrow night, indefinitely." She nodded sunnily. "That's nice for you. I hope you'll have ever so jolly a time, George." "I don't expect to have a particularly jolly time." "Well, then," she laughed, "if I were you, I don't think I'd go." It seemed impossible to impress this distracting creature, to make her serious. "Lucy," he said desperately, "this is our last walk together." "Evidently," she said, "if you're going away tomorrow night." "Lucy, this may be the last time I'll see you, ever in my life." At that she looked at him quickly across her shoulder, but she smiled as brightly as before, and with the same cordial inconsequence. "Oh, I can hardly think that," she said. "And of course I'd be awfully sorry to think it. You're not moving away, are you, to live?" "No." And even if you were, of course you'd be coming back to visit your relatives every now and then. I don't know when I'm coming back. Mother and I are starting tomorrow night for a trip around the world. At this, she did look thoughtful. Your mother is going with you? Good heavens, he groaned. Lucy, doesn't it make any difference to you that I am going? At this, her cordial smile instantly appeared again. Yes, of course, she said. I'm sure I'll miss you ever so much. Are you to be gone long? He stared at her wanly. I told you indefinitely, he said. We've made no plans at all for coming back. That does sound like a long trip, she exclaimed admiringly. Do you plan to be traveling all the time, or will you stay in some one place the greater part of it? I think it would be lovely to— Lucy! He halted, and she stopped with him. They had come to a corner at the edge of the business section of the city, and people were everywhere about them, brushing against them sometimes in passing. I can't stand this, George said in a low voice. I'm just about ready to go in this drugstore here and ask the clerk for something to keep me from dying in my tracks. It's quite a shock, you see, Lucy. What is? To find out certainly at last how deeply you've cared for me, to see how much difference this makes to you. By Jove, I have mattered to you. Her cordial smile was tempered now with good nature. George, she laughed indulgently, surely you don't want me to do pathos on a downtown corner. You wouldn't do pathos anywhere. Well, don't you think pathos is generally rather fooling? I can't stand this any longer, he said. I can't. Goodbye, Lucy. He took her hand. It's goodbye. I think it's goodbye for good, Lucy. Goodbye. I do hope you'll have the most splendid trip. She gave his hand a cordial little grip, then released it lightly. Give my love to your mother. Goodbye. He turned heavily away, and a moment later glanced back over his shoulder. She had not gone on, but stood watching him, that same casual, cordial smile on her face to the very last. And now as he looked back she emphasized her friendly unconcern by waving her small hand to him cheerily, though perhaps with the slightest hint of preoccupation, as if she had begun to think of the errand that brought her downtown. In his mind, George had already explained her to his own poignant dissatisfaction. Some blonde pup, probably, whom she had met during that perfectly gorgeous time, and he strode savagely onward, not looking back again. But Lucy remained where she was until he was out of sight. Then she went slowly into the drugstore which had struck George as a possible source of stimulant for himself. Please let me have a few drops of aromatic spirits of ammonia in a glass of water, she said with the utmost composure. Yes, ma'am, said the impressionable clerk, who had been looking at her through the display window as she stood on the corner. But a moment later, as he turned from the shelves of glass jars against the wall with the potion she had asked for in his hand, he uttered an exclamation. For gosh's sake, miss! And describing this adventure to his fellow boarders that evening, sagged pretty near to the counter she was, he said. If I hadn't been a bright, quick, ready-for-anything young fella, she'd have flummoxed plumb. I was watching her out the window, talking to some young society fella, and she was all right then. She was all right when she came in the store, too. Yes, sir, the prettiest girl that ever walked in our place, and took one good look at me. I reckon it must be the truth what some you town wags say about my face. Chapter 28. At that hour, the heroine of the susceptible clerk's romance was engaged in brightening the rosy little coal fire under the white mantelpiece in her pretty white and blue boudoir. 4 photographs, all framed in decorous plain silver, went to the anthracite's fierce destruction, frames and all, and 3 packets of letters and notes in a charming Florentine treasure box of painted wood. Nor was the box, any more than the silver frames, spared this rousing finish. Thrown heartily upon live coal, the fine wood sparkled forth in stars, then burst into an alarming blaze which scorched the white mantelpiece, but Lucy stood and looked on without moving. It was not Eugene who told her what had happened at Isabel's door. When she got home she found Fanny Minifer waiting for her, a secret excursion of Fanny's for the purpose, presumably, of letting out again. because that was what she did. She told Lucy everything except her own lamentable part in the production of the recent miseries, and concluded with a tribute to George. The worst of it is, he thinks he's been such a hero, and Isabel does too, and that makes him more than twice as awful. It's been the same all his life. Everything he did was noble and perfect. He had a domineering nature to begin with, and she let it go on, and fostered it till it absolutely ruled her. I never saw a plainer case of a person's fault making them pay for having it. She goes about, overseeing the packing and praising George and pretending to be perfectly cheerful about what he's making her do and about the dreadful things he's done. She pretends he did such a fine thing, so manly and protective, going to Mrs. Johnson, and so heroic, doing what his principles made him, even though he knew what it would cost him with you, and all the while it's almost killing her what he said to your father. She's always been lofty enough, so to speak, and had the greatest idea of the Ambersons being superior to the rest of the world and all that. But rudeness, or anything like a scene, or any bad manners, they always just made her sick. But she could never see what George's manners were. Oh, it's been a terrible adulation. It's going to be a task for me living in that big house all alone. You must come and see me. I mean, after they're gone, of course. I'll go crazy if I don't see something of people. I'm sure you'll come as often as you can. I know you too well to think you'll be sensitive about coming there, or being reminded of George. Thank heaven you're too well balanced, Miss Fanny concluded with a profound fervor. You're too well balanced to let anything affect you deeply about that monkey. The 4 photographs and the painted Florentine box went to their cremation within the same hour that Miss Fanny spoke, and a little later Lucy called her father in as he passed her door, and pointed to the blackened area on the underside of the mantelpiece, and to the burnt heap upon the coal, where some metallic shapes still retained outline. She flung her arms about his neck in passionate sympathy, telling him that she knew what had happened to him, and presently he began to comfort her and managed an embarrassed laugh. "Well, well," he said, "I was too old for such foolishness to be getting into my head anyhow. No, no," she sobbed, "and if you knew how I despise myself for ever having thought one instant about— Oh, Miss Fanny called him the right name. That monkey, he is." "There, I think I agree with you," Eugene said grimly, and in his eyes there was a steady light of anger that was to last. "Yes, I think I agree with you about that." "There's only one thing to do with such a person," she said vehemently. "That's to put him out of our thoughts forever, forever." And yet the next day at 6 o'clock, which was the hour Fanny had told her when George and his mother were to leave upon their long journey, Lucy touched that scorched place on her mantle with her hand just as the little clock above it struck. Then, after this odd, unconscious gesture, she went to a window and stood between the curtains, looking out into the cold November dusk, and in spite of every reasoning and reasonable power within her, a pain of loneliness struck through her heart. The dim street below her window, the dark houses across the way, the vague air itself, all looked empty and cold and, most of all, uninteresting. Something more somber than November dusk took the color from them and gave them that air of desertion. The light of her fire flickering up behind her showed suddenly a flying group of tiny snowflakes nearing the window pane, and for an instant she felt the sensation of being dragged through a snowdrift under a broken cutter with a boy's arms about her, an arrogant, handsome, too-conquering boy who nevertheless did his best to get hurt himself, keeping her from any possible harm. She shook the picture out of her eyes indignantly, then came and sat before her fire, and looked long and long at the blackened mantelpiece. She did not have the mantelpiece repainted, and, since she did not, might as well have kept his photographs. One forgets what made the scar upon his hand, but not what made the scar upon his wall. She played no Marcia Funebre upon her piano, even though Chopin's Romantic Lamentation was then at the top of 9/10 of the music racks in the country, American youth having recently discovered the distinguished congeniality between itself and this deathless bit of deathly gloom. She did not even play Robin Adair. She played Bedelia and all the new cakewalks, for she was her father's housekeeper, and rightly looked upon the office as being the same as that of his heart-keeper. Therefore it was her affair to keep both house and heart in what state of cheerfulness might be contrived. She made him go out more than ever, made him take her to all the gaieties of that winter, declining to go herself unless he took her, and, though Eugene danced no more, and quoted Shakespeare to prove all Lightfoot caperings beneath the dignity of his age, she broke his resolution for him at the New Year's Eve assembly, and half coaxed, half dragged him forth upon the floor, and made him dance the New Year in with her. New faces appeared at the dances of the winter. New faces had been appearing everywhere, for that matter, and familiar ones were disappearing, merged in the increasing crowd, or gone forever and missed a little and not long, for the town was growing and changing as it never had grown and changed before. It was heaving up in the middle incredibly. It was spreading incredibly, and as it heaved and spread, it befouled itself and darkened its sky. Its boundary was mere shapelessness on the run. A raw new house would appear on a country road. 4 or 5 others would presently be built at intervals between it and the outskirts of the town. The country road would turn into an asphalt street with a brick-faced drugstore and a frame grocery at a corner. Then bungalows and 6-room cottages would swiftly speckle the open green spaces, and a farm had become a suburb, which would immediately shoot out other suburbs into the country on one side, and on the other join itself solidly to the city. You drove between pleasant fields and woodland groves one spring day, and in the autumn, passing over the same ground, you were warned off the tracks by an interurban trolley car's gonging, and beheld, beyond cement sidewalks just dry, new house owners busy moving in. Gasoline and electricity were performing the miracles Eugene had predicted. But the great change was in the citizenry itself. What was left of the patriotic old stock generation that had fought the Civil War and subsequently controlled politics had become venerable and was little heeded. The descendants of the pioneers and early settlers were merging into the new crowd, becoming part of it, little to be distinguished from it. What happened to Boston and to Broadway happened in degree to the Midland city. The old stock became less and less typical, and of the grown people who called the place home, less than a third had been born in it. There was a German quarter, there was a Jewish quarter, there was a Negro quarter, square miles of it called Bucktown. There were many Irish neighborhoods, and there were large settlements of Italians and of Hungarians, and of Romanians and of Serbians and other Balkan peoples. But not the emigrants themselves were the almost dominant type on the streets downtown. That type was the emigrants' prosperous offspring, descendants of the emigrations of the 70s and 80s and 90s, those great folk journeyings in search not so directly of freedom and democracy as of more money for the same labor. A new Midlander, in fact a new American, was beginning dimly to emerge. A new spirit of citizenship had already sharply defined itself. It was idealistic, and its ideals were expressed in the new kind of young men in business downtown. They were optimists to the point of belligerence, their motto being "Boost, don't knock." And they were hustlers, believing in hustling and in honesty because both paid. They loved their city and worked for it with a plutonic energy which was always ardently vocal. They were viciously governed, but they sometimes went so far to struggle for better government on account of the helpful effect of good government on the price of real estate and betterment generally. The politicians could not go too far with them and knew it. The idealists planned and strove and shouted that their city should become a better, better, and better city. And what they meant when they used the word better was more prosperous. And the core of their idealism was this: the more prosperous my beloved city, the more prosperous beloved I. They had one supreme theory, that the perfect beauty and happiness of cities and of human life was to be brought about by more factories. They had a mania for factories. There was nothing they would not do to cajole a factory away from another city, and they were never more piteously embittered than when another city cajoled one away from them. What they meant by prosperity was credit at the bank. But in exchange for this credit they got nothing that was not dirty and therefore, to a sane mind, valueless, since whatever was cleaned was dirty again before the cleaning was half done. For as the town grew, it grew dirty with an incredible completeness. The idealists put up magnificent business buildings and boasted of them, but the buildings were begrimed before they were finished. They boasted of their libraries, of their monuments and statues, and poured soot on them. They boasted of their schools, but the schools were dirty like the children within them. This was not the fault of the children or their mothers. It was the fault of the idealists, who said, "The more dirt, the more prosperity." They drew patriotic, optimistic breaths of the flying, powdered filth of the streets, and took the foul and heavy smoke with gusto into the profundities of their lungs. "Boost, don't knock," they said. And every year or so they boomed a great clean-up week, when everybody was supposed to get rid of the tin cans in his backyard. They were happiest when the tearing down and building up were most riotous, and when new factory districts were thundering into life. In truth, the city came to be like the body of a great dirty man, skinned to show his busy works, yet wearing a few barbaric ornaments. And such a figure, carved, colored, and discolored, and set up in the marketplace, would have done well enough as the god of the new people. Such a god they had indeed made in their own image, as all peoples make the God they truly serve. Though, of course, certain of the idealists went to church on Sunday, and there knelt to another, considered to be impractical in business. But while the growing went on, this god of their marketplace was their true god, their familiar and spirit control. They did not know that they were his helplessly obedient slaves. Nor could they ever hope to realize their serfdom, as the first step toward becoming free men, until they should make the strange and hard discovery that matter should serve man's spirit. Prosperity meant good credit at the bank, black lungs, and housewives' purgatory. The women fought the dirt all they could, but if they let the air into their houses, they let in the dirt. It shortened their lives and kept them from the happiness of ever seeing anything white. And thus, as the city grew, the time came when Lucy, after a hard struggle, had to give up her blue and white curtains and her white walls. Indoors, she put everything into dull gray and brown, and outside had the little house painted the dark green nearest to black. Then she knew, of course, that everything was as dirty as ever, but was a little less distressed because it no longer looked so dirty as it was. These were bad times for Amberson Addition. This quarter, already old, lay within a mile of the center of the town, but business moved in other directions, and the Addition's share of prosperity was only the smoke and dirt, with the bank credit left out. The owners of the original big houses sold them or rented them to boarding-house keepers, and the tenants of the multitude of small houses moved further out, where the smoke was thinner, or into apartment houses, which were built by dozens now. Cheaper tenants took their places, and the rents were lower and lower, and the houses shabbier and shabbier, for all these shabby houses, burning soft coal, did their best to help in the destruction of their own value. They helped to make the quarter so dingy and the air so foul to breathe that no one would live there who had money enough to get farther out, where there were glimpses of ungrayed sky and breaths of cleaner winds. and with the coming of the new speed, Further Out was now as close to business as the addition had been in the days of its prosperity. Distances had ceased to matter. The 5 new houses, built so closely where had been the fine lawn of the Amberson mansion, did not look new. When they were a year old, they looked as old as they would ever look, and 2 of them were vacant, having never been rented, for the Major's mistake about apartment houses had been a disastrous one. He guessed wrong, George Amberson said. He guessed wrong at just the wrong time. Housekeeping in a house is harder than in an apartment, and where the smoke and dirt are as thick as they are in the additions, women can't stand it. People were crazy for apartments. Too bad he couldn't have seen it in time. Poor man. He digs away at his ledgers by his old gas drop-light lamp almost every night. He still refuses to let the mansion be torn up for wiring, you know. But he had one painful satisfaction this spring. He got his taxes lowered. Amberson laughed ruefully, and Fanny Minifer asked how the Major could have managed such an economy. They were sitting upon the veranda at Isabel's one evening during the 3rd summer of the absence of their nephew and his mother, and the conversation had turned toward Amberson finances. "I said it was a painful satisfaction, Fanny," he explained. "The property has gone down in value, and they assessed it lower than they did 15 years ago. But farther out— oh, yes, farther out. Prices are magnificent farther out, and farther in, too. We just happen to be the wrong spot, that's all. Not that I don't think something could be done if Father would let me have a hand, but he won't. He can't, I suppose, I ought to say. He's always done his own figuring, he says, and it's his lifelong habit to keep his affairs, and even his books to himself, and just hand us out the money. Heaven knows he's done enough of that." He sighed, and both were silent, looking out at the long flares of the constantly passing automobile headlights, shifting in vast geometric demonstrations against the darkness. Now and then a bicycle wound its nervous way among these portents, or at long intervals a surrey or buggy plodded forlornly by. "There seem to be so many ways of making money nowadays," Fanny said thoughtfully. "Every day I hear of a new fortune some person has got hold of, one way or another. Nearly always it's somebody you never heard of. It doesn't seem all to be in just making motor cars. I hear there's a great deal in manufacturing these things that motor cars use, new inventions particularly. I met dear old Frank Bronson the other day, and he told me— "Oh, yes, even dear old Frank's got the fever," Amberson laughed. "He's as wild as any of them. He told me about this invention he's got into, too. Millions in it. Some new electric headlight better than anything yet. Every car in America can't help but have 'em and all that. He's putting half he's laid by into it, and the fact is he almost talked me into getting Father to finance me enough for me to go into it. Poor Father, he's financed me before. I suppose he would again if I had the heart to ask him, and this seems to be a good thing, though probably old Frank is a little too sanguine. At any rate, I've been thinking it over." "So have I," Fanny admitted. "He seemed to be certain it would pay 25% the first year, and enormously more after that, and I'm only getting 4 on my little principal. People are making such enormous fortunes out of everything to do with motor cars. It does seem as if—" She paused. "Well, I told him I'd think it over seriously." "We may turn out to be partners and millionaires, then," Amberson laughed. "I thought I'd ask Eugene's advice." "I wish you would," said Fanny. "He probably knows exactly how much profit there would be in this." Eugene's advice was to go slow. He thought electric lights for automobiles were coming, someday, but probably not until certain difficulties could be overcome. Altogether, he was discouraging, but by this time his 2 friends had the fever as thoroughly as old Frank Bronson himself had it, for they had been with Bronson to see the light working beautifully in a machine shop. They were already enthusiastic, and after asking Eugene's opinion they argued with him, telling him how they had seen with their own eyes that the difficulties he mentioned had been overcome. "Perfectly," Fanny cried. "And if it worked in the shop, it's bound to work any place else, isn't it?" He would not agree that it was bound to, yet, being pressed, was driven to admit that it might, and, retiring from what was developing into an oratorical contest, repeated a warning about not putting too much into it. George Amberson also laid stress on this caution later, though the Major had financed him again, and he was going in. "You must be careful to leave yourself a margin of safety, Fanny," he said. "I'm confident that it is a pretty conservative investment of its kind, and all the chances are with us, but you must be careful to leave yourself enough to fall back on in case anything should go wrong." Fanny deceived him. In the impossible event of anything going wrong, she would have enough left to live on, she declared, and laughed excitedly, for she was having the best time that had come to her since Wilbur's death. Like so many women for whom money had always been provided without their understanding how, she was prepared to be a thorough and irresponsible plunger. Amberson, in his wearier way, shared her excitement, and in the winter, when the exploiting company had been formed, and he brought Fanny her importantly engraved shares of stock, he reverted to his prediction of possibilities made when they first spoke of the new light. "We seem to be partners all right," he laughed. "Now let's go ahead and be millionaires before Isabel and young George come home." "When they come home," she echoed sorrowfully, and it was a phrase which found an evasive echo in Isabel's letters. In these letters Isabel was always planning pleasant things that she and Fanny and the Major and George and brother George would do when she and her son came home. "They'll find things pretty changed, I'm afraid," Fanny said, "if they ever do come home." Amberson went over the next summer and joined his sister and nephew in Paris, where they were living. "Isabel does want to come home," he told Fanny gravely on the day of his return in October. "She's wanted to for a long while, and she ought to come while she can stand the journey." And he amplified this statement, leaving Fanny looking startled and solemn when Lucy came by to drive him out to dinner at the new house Eugene had just completed. This was no white and blue cottage, but a great Georgian picture in brick, 5 miles north of Amberson Addition, with 4 acres of its own hedged land between it and its next neighbor. And Amberson laughed wistfully as they turned in between the stone and brick gate pillars and rolled up the crushed stone driveway. "I wonder, Lucy, if history's going on forever repeating itself," he said. "I wonder if this town's going on building up things and rolling over them, as poor father once said it was rolling over his poor old heart. It looks like it. Here's the Amberson mansion again, only it's Georgian instead of nondescript Romanesque. But it's just the same Amberson mansion that my father built long before you were born. The only difference is that it's your father who's built this one now. It's all the same in the long run." Lucy did not quite understand, but she laughed as a friend should, and, taking his arm, showed him through vast rooms where ivory-paneled walls and trim window hangings were reflected dimly in dark rugless floors, and the sparse furniture showed that Lucy had been collecting with a long purse. "By Jove," he said, "you have been going it. Fanny tells me you had a great housewarming dance, and you kept right on being the belle of the ball, not any softer-hearted than you used to be. Fred Kinney's father said you refused Fred so often that he got engaged to Janie Sharon just to prove that someone would have him in spite of his hair. Well, the material world do move, and you've got the new kind of house it moves into nowadays, if it has the new price. And even the grand old expanses of plate glass we used to be so proud of at the other Amberson mansion, they've gone too, with the crowded heavy gold and red stuff. Curious. We've still got the plate glass windows, though all we can see out of them is the smoke and the old Johnson house, which is a counter-jumper's boarding house now, while you've got a view, and you cut it all up into little panes. Well, you're pretty refreshingly out of the smoke up here." "Yes, for a while," Lucy laughed, "until it comes and we have to move out farther." "No, you'll stay here," he assured her. "There will be somebody else who will move out farther." He continued to talk of the house after Eugene arrived, and gave them no account of his journey until they had retired from the dinner table to Eugene's library, a gray and shadowy room where their coffee was brought. Then, equipped with a cigar which seemed to occupy his attention, Amberson spoke in a casual tone of his sister and her son. "I found Isabel as well as usual," he said, "only I'm afraid as usual isn't particularly well. Sydney and Amelia had been up to Paris in the spring, but she hadn't seen them. Somebody told her they were there, it seems. They'd left Florence and were living in Rome. Amelia has become a Catholic, and is said to give great sums to charity, and to go about with the gentry in consequence, but Sydney's ailing and lives in a wheelchair most of the time. It struck me Isabel ought to be doing the same thing." He paused, bestowing minute care upon the removal of the little band from his cigar, and as he seemed to have concluded his narrative, Eugene spoke out of the shadow beyond a heavily shaded lamp. "What do you mean by that?" he asked quietly. "Oh, she's cheerful enough," said Amberson, still not looking at either his young hostess or her father. "At least," he added, "she manages to seem so. I'm afraid she hasn't been really well for several years. She isn't stout, you know. She hasn't changed in looks much, and she seems rather alarmingly short of breath for a slender person. Father's been that way for years, of course, but never nearly so much as Isabel is now. Of course, she makes nothing of it, but it seemed rather serious to me when I noticed she had to stop and rest twice to get up the one short flight of stairs in their new 2-floor apartment. I told her I thought she ought to make George let her come home." "Let her?" Eugene repeated in a low voice. "Does she want to?" "She doesn't urge it. George seems to like the life there, in his grand, gloomy, and peculiar way. And of course she'll never change about being proud of him and all that. He's quite a swell. But in spite of anything she said, rather than because, I know she does indeed want to come. She'd like to be with Father, of course, and I think she intimated one day that she feared it might even happen that she wouldn't get to see him again. At the time, I thought she referred to his age and feebleness, but on the boat, coming home, I remembered the little look of wistfulness, yet of resignation, with which she said it, and it struck me all at once that I'd been mistaken. I saw she was really thinking of her own state of health." "I see," Eugene said, his voice even lower than it had been before. "And you say he won't let her come home?" Amberson laughed, but still continued to be interested in his cigar. "Oh, I don't think he uses force. He's very gentle with her. I doubt if the subject is mentioned between them, and yet, knowing my interesting nephew as you do, wouldn't you think that was about the way to put it?" "Knowing him as I do, yes," said Eugene slowly. "Yes, I should think that was about the way to put it." A murmur out of the shadows beyond him, a faint sound, musical and feminine, yet expressive of a notable intensity, seemed to indicate that Lucy was of the same opinion.